The invention that changed the world. How a small group of radar process pioneers won the Second World War and launched a technical revolution by Robert Buderi. Preface. I first learned about the radiation laboratory, the cradle of much World War II radar development, and the technological revolution that roared in war's wake not long after arriving at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the fall of 1986 for a year-long fellowship program for science writers. The other fellows and I were on our way to a seminar dealing with the study of ancient Incan life based on analysis of metals found in various artifacts. We trudged across the campus, past the swank, IMP designed media lab and the biological building when our eyes came to rest upon a rickety three-story eyesore erected along Vassar Street on the school's northwest border. I had already become accustomed to some of MIT physical backwardness. Virtually all of the buildings are old and grimy, the linoleum paved hallways somewhat musty, the laboratory stocked with the tottering wooden desk and seemingly built to accommodate a Bunsen burner far more readily than a laser. But nowhere is the contrast between aging physical space and the school's reputation as a leader in science and technology greater than with Building 20, the heart of the Rad Lab. From the wood and asbestos shingle exterior to the exposed pipes and wires running down its half-century-old corridors, the low-flung monstrosity fairly screams for demolition. Building 20 turned out to be the stuff of campus legends. The edifice is so ugly, espouses Fred Hapgood in Up the Infinite Corridor, a book about MIT, that it is impossible not to admire it. If that makes sense, it has 10 times the righteous nerdy swagger of any other building on campus. Stories were rampant. A homeless botanist had lived in the storeroom, apparently for years, turning down a job at a Chicago museum in order to remain the phantom of Building 20. The anemic structure played host to pioneering communication studies. It is where Harold Doc Edgerton, inventor of stroboscopic photography, conducted early experiments in the underwater imaging and sonar. Bose Corporation of speaker fame got its start there, as did the acoustic consulting firm of Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, which evolved into the wide-ranging internet systems provider BBN Corporation. Since the early 1960s, the third floor of E-Wing has housed the Tech Model Railroad Club, from whose devotees sprang many first-generation computer hackers. Ah, Building 20? Sighed the neurophysiologist Jerome Letvin, who himself padded its creaky halls for 30 years. It's kind of messy, but by God, it's procreative. It all started with radar. To house the rapidly expanding radiation lab, Building 20 was designed in less than an afternoon and erected in 6 furious months at the end of 1943. Fashioned of heavy wood timber because steel was unavailable during World War II, Cambridge officials had to exempt it from city building codes. Building 20 was a temporary creation, slated to be put out of its misery at war's end. But that hadn't happened 40-odd years later when I first came to the campus. And it still hasn't happened, although the historic structure is scheduled for demolition in spring '98 to make room for a massive engineering complex. Even before I knew its history, Building 20 fascinated me. What is it doing here? I wanted to know. Why was it ever built? Victor McElhenney, the fellowship director and living database of history, filled me in on the basics, telling me how the Rad Lab had played a critical role in World War II, and a bit of how instrumental the radar work had been in weaving the fabric of contemporary society. This was just what a writer hopes for, a great, largely untold story. I went straight to the MIT archives and located a copy of 5 Years at the Radiation Laboratory, a kind of yearbook for Rad Lab veterans put out in 1946, not long after the war ended. The fascinating book lists staff members and many of the wartime projects, though sections had been intriguingly blanked out for security reasons. Along with it, I found a copy of Radiation Laboratory Handbook, which spells out work hours, security procedures, and the like. The discoveries brought the enterprise more alive in my mind. In the summer of 1987, after the fellowship ended, I grabbed a flight to New York and interviewed II Rabbi, a Nobel Prize winner who had served as the Rad Lab's research director. He was to the lab what Building 20 became to MIT, the physical embodiment of its spirit. His biography, containing 2 chapters on the radar work, had recently been published. But I wanted to know far more. I met the legendary physicist in the Riverside Drive apartment. I was largely winging it, unsure which questions to ask. He was old and somewhat feeble, as it turned out, only a few months from his death. It was not a very good interview. By the time I began writing this book, the notes from our conversation had been hopelessly misplaced. My tape recording turned out so garbled that Rabbi could not be understood. But I remember well Rabbi's keen sense of pride in the laboratory's accomplishments and in being a part of it. In course of writing this book and talking with many of his colleagues, I have encountered this feeling again and again. I returned from New York with a vague hope that someday I would tell the lab story and chronicle's radar critical importance to the war. At first, the book I envisioned started on the eve of World War II and ended with the Japanese surrender. I didn't imagine as I got on the plane to come home later that sat down at my computer to type some notes, made a phone call, even warmed up a cup of coffee, that I was benefiting from the technological children of radar. It is this great legacy, going far beyond the war, to include radar's tremendous importance to post-war science and technology, that this book seeks to capture. What arose from World War II microwave radar work was a dramatic, concentrated example of the endless intertwinement of science and technology. Scientists, many of them nuclear physicists, were forced to put research on hold during the war years for sake of technology, microwave radar that almost no one knew anything about. They became experts in the field, drawing on physics to help develop the technology, which in turn taught them techniques critical to science. With these came breakthroughs that gave rise to new technologies. The radiation lab, coupled with relative microwave radar endeavors in the United States and Britain, emerged as a science and technology incubator on a scale probably unprecedented in history. At least 2 Nobel Prizes for nuclear magnetic resonance and the MASTER can be traced directly to wartime radar work. Every day, several thousand commercial air carriers take to skies. Virtually all of the aircraft are tracked continuously by radar, sometimes to and from their gates. It takes more than 300 radars backed up by a ponderous array of display screens, communication nets, and personnel just to keep the U.S. skies organized. Thousands more radar sets provide extra eyes for ships, boats, and pleasure craft. Many vessels also draw on the global navigation network LORAN. Virtually all of these sprang directly from the RAD lab, as do much of the world's storm watching systems and the TV weather report. The transistor, via the legacy of the solid state semiconductor crystals that form the heart of radar receivers, is largely a product of work contracted by the RAD lab to places like Purdue University, University of Pennsylvania, and Bell Labs, the second largest of the wartime radar houses. Digital computers, including their cathode ray displays and memories, owe a great debt to radar. They are the offspring of World War II. Microwave telephones and early television networks got critical boosts from wartime radar. The technology made a huge impact on astronomy by opening a region of the electromagnetic spectrum, radio as opposed to optical. That ultimately brought on the discovery of pulsars, quasars, and a plethora of hidden galaxies. And the list hardly stops there. Every particle accelerators owe a great debt to the Building 20 eyesore. So does microwave spectroscopy. So too do the microwave ovens common in today's homes. For a secret radar transmitter carried from Britain to America in the fall of 1940 forms the very core of these time-saving appliances. Early in the book's planning stages, it became clear that writing a definitive history of radar and its almost panoramic impact on science and technology was impossible if one sought to maintain a strong and effective narrative. I wanted to tell the story of people, not technological processes, bringing out their escapades, from the silly to the deadly serious, and fleshing out their thoughts and motivations, fears, and rivalries. The downside of focusing on relatively few individuals is that the contributions of others on the narrative's periphery occasionally must be omitted. And at a place like the Rad Lab, everybody stood on the shoulders of many others. It was truly an interdisciplinary cooperative effort. Still, I have attempted to identify the central personages, most of whom I have interviewed. In a similar vein, while the book describes critical events and areas of pursuit, I've sometimes had to brush over less compelling but still noteworthy areas. For the World War II period, since the Rad Lab concerned himself mainly the European conflict, it is the Pacific front that gets relatively short shrift. For the post-war years, when radar's technological and scientific payoffs exploded on a vast number of fronts, I have only touched on such important subjects as air traffic control, weather forecasting, and maritime radar. Happily, just before the publication of the paperback edition of this book, Lewis Brown unveiled his own radar manuscript, Technical and Military Imperatives, a radar history of World War II, which fills in many of the holes in the World War II period and brings to light many of the finer points of German radar. Hopefully, one day others will do the same for radar's post-war legacy. Exacting pains were taken to get things right. Besides consulting books and archives on 3 continents, I have sought out the radar pioneers themselves to mine their recollections and fill holes in written record. When thoughts on or emotions are presented, it is what people said or wrote they were thinking and feeling. Memories are tricky things, especially after 50 years. Accounts of events were cross-checked with paper trail as well as the recollections of others. In cases where conflicts were proven irreconcilable, words such as probably or apparently are used to alert the reader that this is merely a best estimate, and my reasoning is often explained in the notes section. I learned much about history from this project, enough to give serious pause. Sometimes I uncovered mistakes that had been passed on, even by the principals themselves, until they became accepted as fact. This caused me to wonder how many similar undetected errors are contained in my own work. Everything I have written is attributable to a source, but beyond my own slip-ups in understanding and synthesis, what if the sources were wrong? I have been left with a profound sense that so much of history is not truth, only what is accepted as truth. I will never regard history in quite the same light. This is not a statement of disillusionment, but rather enlightenment. It is entirely possible to miss certain details, but paint the overall picture with the right hues, just as a straightforward account of the paper trail often misses the heart of the story, the people. So while what is contained in these pages may be something less than a total account, by seeking out the human dimension, I hope it eliminates something much greater, the unmistakable spirit of innovation and discovery that sprang from a critical technology and caused people to believe in and change the face of the modern world. Chapter 1. The most valuable cargo. When the members of the Tizard mission brought one to America in 1940, they carried the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. Quote, James Finney Baxter III, official historian of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. The black japanned metal deed box could just be seen above the wartime throngs of the shoulder of a railway porter. The small container bobbed along frustratingly out of our reach as Eddie Bowen zigzagged through the crowd in hot pursuit. Only moments before, sometime around 8:15 the morning of August 29, 1940, the Welshman had arrived at London's Euston Station with the box safely in his possession. Innocently, Bowen had launched it to the porter while gathering up his remaining luggage then watched helplessly as the man headed off to find the 8:30 train to Liverpool without waiting for his customer. As he struggled to keep the porter in sight, Bowen would not have drawn much attention from busy Londoners. In stature and build, he blended into a crowd and would have seemed like any other young man in a hurry. Only his face set him slightly apart. Wavy haircut crowned a wide forehead and a jaw and gave his head a squared off look. Old photographs often show an infectious grin spanning the broad tableau. But one could also imagine the weathered visage locked in determination, and that August morning Bowen had reason to be concerned. Just 5 days short of the war's first anniversary, Britain faced one of the most desperate hours. Bombs were falling lightly on Liverpool. Nazi armies ringed the country from the Norwegian coast down to France, and an invasion was expected within weeks. As Bowen knew, the seemingly ordinary solicitor's deed box, now visible, now not in Euston's morning rush, held the power to change the course of the conflict. Inside lay nothing less than the military secrets of Britain. Virtually every single technological item in the country could bring to bear on the war. Had some freak accident burst the lock off the chest, the platform would have been awash in blueprints and circuit diagrams for rockets, explosives, superchargers, gyroscopic gun sights, submarine detection devices, self-sealing fuel tanks, and even the initial germs of the jet engine and the atomic bomb. Among these treasures, nothing carried the all-pervasive importance of the resonant cavity magnetron, Britain's most closely guarded secret. The black box contained one of the first 12 production copies of the mysterious device, probably the only piece of hardware it sheltered. Small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, the magnetron looked like a clay pigeon used in skeet shooting, with a few couplings thrown in. Yet it could spit out pulses of microwave radio energy on a wavelength of about 10 centimeters, so powerful conventional scientific wisdom still put anything like it years off. The magnetron was a radar transmitter, with the potential to bolster British military capabilities almost across the board and give the country the upper hand in what already seemed like a technological war. No one in the country knew it, but the Germans were generally ahead in the radar race until the device arrived on the scene. More immediately to the point, as Bowen chased the porter across the Euston platform, the largely copper disc offered a way to invigorate the strapped British defense that had been coping with Luftwaffe bombing onslaughts the past 6 weeks, a softening up before Hitler's planned invasion. Radar, or radio distance finding, as Bowen's countrymen called the technology, formed the backbone of these defenses. Imposing towers up to 350 feet tall, the chain home station network lined the country's south and east coasts to provide the only effective early warning of German attacks. These electronic sentries operated around the clock, rain or shine, sending out pulses of radio energy and picking up the faint echo from the enemy aircraft more than 100 miles away. Radar was basically all the outgunned country had that enabled fighter command to husband its too thin air resources. Without it, planners would have to be considered keeping standing patrols aloft, wasting fuel, needlessly fatiguing pilots, and risking being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Magnetrons represented the next crucial step, a leap really, in the evolution. The chain home stations worked well in daylight when a pilot's sharp eyes could correct for the several mile error range inherent in their long operating wavelengths of between 10 and 30 meters. But to cut losses, the Germans were widely expected to move soon to concentrated night attacks, when visibility was slashed dramatically. The British had tried to supplement the chain by installing short-range systems inside fighter aircraft. The idea behind this was that once the main network got the interceptors closed, airborne radars could carry them the rest of the way. But these remained clumsy and inaccurate. Only the magnetron seemed certain to keep the British well ahead of the game. Its 10-centimeter transmissions ran a mere 15th those of standard airborne radars. Fitted into night fighters, such a device would generate sharper pulses in a tightly concentrated parcel of energy that would fan out far less during the brief journey to an enemy aircraft and back, making it immensely easier for pilots to home in on their quarry even in the darkest nights. That, though, was only the beginning, although the magnetron had been invented just 8 months earlier by two physicists at the University of Birmingham. Its portability and versatility soon summoned visions of putting the beleaguered nation on the offensive. Aircraft equipped with centimeter radar might pick out U-boat periscopes rising under cover of darkness. Lancaster and other bombers could use the extremely short waves the magnetron produced to illuminate the way through the thick cloud cover, obscuring Hitler's forces and factories on the European continent, keeping planes flying on days the Royal Air Force would normally be grounded. Yet for all the device's promise, a series of technical glitches continued to plague its development, the most serious stumbling block being uneven power performance. British industry, with its limited production capacity and already under the threat of bombardment and invasion, simply could not trust that it alone possessed capability for correcting the problems and turning out magnetrons in the number needed for war. This overriding concern, not just in regard to the cavity magnetron, but extended to all the devices in the black box, brought Bowen to the Houston platform that August morning. Though still 4 months shy of this 30th birthday, the Welsh physicist ranked as one of Britain's defense pioneers. For the past 5 years, he had labored in some of the island's most isolated spots, sometimes night and day, to develop the chain home network and the country's first crude airborne radar systems. As a leading defense scientist, he had been tapped to join a top secret government mission aimed largely at convincing the still uncommitted American government and key industrial officials to pick up where British resources left off. The mission was to sail from Liverpool that night. To pave the way for the venture, a special team had spent the first 2 weeks of August rounding up the black box's contents. Bowen himself had visited the General Electric Company research laboratory in the London suburb of Wembley, where he picked out the best working model of the first dozen magnetrons made. He had then carried his selection unescorted on the underground to the Ministry of Supply headquarters between London's Victoria Embankment and the Strand. At the ministry, the precious cargo had been placed safely in the black box, remaining under lock and key until the evening of the 28th, when Bowen returned to the escort the entire booty to Liverpool. A guard delivered it via the arched doorway on the ministry back steps. From there, Bowen hailed a taxi to whisk him to the Cumberland Hotel, not far from the Euston Historic Marble Arch. Because the box would not fit in the hotel safe, Bowen had spent the night with England's greatest military secrets wedged under his bed. In the morning, to add to his discomfort, the cabbie taking him to the train station would not allow the small chest inside the taxi, insisting it be placed on the roof. The Welshman had thought all was well when the cab finally reached the Euston, but then the fast-footed porter had prolonged his unease. Bowen didn't catch up with the man until they reached the train. At this point, he knew only the first-class seat had been reserved. But when he found his place, it appeared an entire compartment had been set aside. The blinds were drawn and reserved notices placed on the windows. Intrigue. Bowen sat down to wait for the train to leave, figuring all the world would become clear on the other end. A few minutes before departure, a well-dressed and exceptionally trim man with a school tie entered the compartment. With scarcely a glance around, the man took up the seat diagonally across from Bowen and began reading a newspaper. The mysterious companion didn't speak until a few minutes after the train began edging out of the station, when some latecomers opened the door, happy to have found an empty cabin. "Out!" he ordered. Don't you see this is specially reserved? Bowen was struck not so much by the man's words as the commanding tone of the delivery. The would-be intruders wilted, he later recalled, and we had no further interruptions. At that moment, for the first time in a harrowing 16 hours or so, Bowen realized, too, that his precious cargo carried some form of protection. The journey passed in silence. When the train finally pulled into Liverpool's dockside station, Bowen, following instructions to stay put on an army escort, arrived to pick up the box, didn't budge from his seat. His compartment mate also remained in place, ostensibly absorbed in the paper. At last, a dozen fully armed soldiers marched down the platform and came to the glorious rifle-slapping halt alongside the car. The sergeant barked some orders, but put the group at ease and dispatched 3 men to collect the cargo. Bowen watched as Britain's technological pride and joy was carried outside, hoisted onto some shoulders, and marched back down the platform. The display of military exactitude eased the young physicist's mind, but not totally. Telling the story later, he joked, "I was beginning to feel that things were well looked after. Alternately, if this was the enemy making off with Britain's secrets, they were making a spectacular job of it." Through all the commands and gestures, Bowen's mysterious cabin mate still had not uttered a companionable word. Now the man rolled up his paper and, with a slight nod at his fellow traveler, took his leave. Bowen also roused himself and shuffled along a Gladstone dock to find his ship, the Duchess of Richmond. On board the Canadian liner, he joined the main body of what was formerly called the British Technical and Scientific Mission to the United States. Informally and far more commonly, the venture was known as the Tizard Mission, after its organizer, Sir Henry Tizard, rector of the Imperial College of Science and Technology and chairman of the government's key scientific committee on air defense. Tizard, an Oxford-trained chemist, had already made his name on one of Britain's shrewdest scientific visionaries. Beginning in 1935, his Committee for Scientific Survey of Air Defense had pushed radio direction, finding over all other competitors, sound mirrors, infrared detection, balloon barrages. In the late 1939, recognizing the need for American assistance in developing radar and other military technologies, he had conceived the idea of an exchange mission with the United States. His proposal had received strong support from the Archibald Vivian Hill, the influential Nobel laureate and joint secretary of the Royal Society, who had gone to America early in 1940 to grease the wheels on the other side of the Atlantic. The plan hinged on making a full disclosure of the kingdom's technical secrets in hopes that America, even if it stayed neutral, would gear up its immense industrial machine to help develop and produce them. Initially, many British authorities wanted to trade secret for secret, seeing the exchange as a way to pry loose details of the coveted American Norden bomb site. But after months of infighting and wrangling, new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had taken over the governmental reins in May 1940 on the heels of the German Blitz into Western Europe, decided to make the offer with no strings attached. American cooperation would be more complete, the prevailing view held. There was no attempt to barter secret for secret. So complete was the offering that by the time Eddie Bowen walked along the Liverpool docks that August afternoon, only 2 items of any note had been held back: some particulars of the jet engine and details of the latest German magnetic mines used to block British harbors. Besides the crucial cavity magnetron, nearly everything about radar could be found in the black box. And several containers of working sets and components, apparently, had been sent through separate channels to supplement its contents. Tizard deliberately restricted the mission to just 7 members, counting himself. Bowen was his hand-picked radar expert. Cambridge University physicist John Cockcroft, architect of one of the world's first proton accelerators, would brief the Americans on the remainder of the technological booty, as well as a few isolated aspects of radar. In addition to the two scientists, each of Britain's three services, the Royal Air Force, the Admiralty, and the Army, contributed an officer with the recent combat experience who could talk about military needs. The last member was Arthur Edgar Woodward Nutt, an Air Ministry official who served as mission secretary. Tizard and one of the mission's military representatives, Group Captain F.L. Pierce of the Royal Air Force, had flown across the Atlantic a few days ahead of the main body to pave the way for the exchange. But the other members would make the crossing with Bowen on the Duchess. With the black box safely escorted off the train, the Welshman's responsibility had ended. Aboard ship, Woodward Nutt, the sole member of the entourage, allowed access to the chest during the voyage, saw the secret cargo locked in the strong room. He arranged to meet the third officer who held the keys in the event of a German attack, so they could dump the rich bounty overboard. The ship left its mooring that evening, inching down the Mersey River toward the Irish Sea. An air raid hit Liverpool, with a few bomb splashes rocking the boat right after dinner, so the crew anchored down for a night near the river mouth. The Duchess finally set sail the next morning. Friday, August 30th, minesweepers escorted the liner the rest of the way through the Mersey, which was littered with wrecked boats. Later, two destroyers took over, shepherding the vessel through heavy seas for a few hours until she built speed and opened a zigzag course to elude any lurking U-boats. Tizard mission members passed time aboard ship in the usual way, reading, listening to BBC broadcasts, playing deck games and bingo, watching films in the ship's cinema, and taking brisk walks in the cold North Atlantic air. About 1,000 sailors also took berths on the Duchess, bound to pick up the first aged U.S. destroyers consigned to Britain in exchange for the rights to various naval and air bases. The well-known Cockcroft lectured the board servicemen on a scientific subject he felt safe to discuss, since it couldn't possibly have a bearing on the war, nuclear energy. He impressed the audience by pronouncing that a cupful of water held enough atomic power to blow a battleship a foot out of the sea. In a more private exercise, Cockcroft also calculated that the black box chances of sinking with the ship should they be struck by an enemy torpedo, and concluded the buoyant cargo would stay afloat. Holes were drilled in each end. On the evening of September 5th, the ship pulled off Newfoundland's Cape Race. The following morning dawned calm and misty as she slipped into Halifax Harbor. Bowen remembered spying an American armored vehicle, submachine guns bristling from every orifice. Woodward Nutt, though, recorded spending several hours on the phone with British Embassy in Washington, arranging for a Canadian military guard to take the secret equipment to the U.S. border, where it would be turned over to the American authorities and transported to the embassy. He personally saw the equipment off the next day. At Halifax, Bowen split off from the rest of the group, heading to Ottawa to arrange for officials from Canada's National Research Council to join the exchange and to locate some of the equipment presumably shipped over there earlier. He would catch up with the others in Washington a few days later. The rest of the mission left Nova Scotia by rail at 8:45 in the morning of the 7th, changing trains in Boston and arriving in Washington at 5:30 the next evening. The group met Tizard at the Shoreham Hotel overlooking Rock Creek Park near the British Embassy in Northwest Washington. I was a bit shaken, writes Woodward Nutt, to find that the samples and documents that I had seen off so carefully at Halifax had not yet arrived. It took a series of telephone calls to locate the cargo. The precious container bearing the cavity magnetron and the technological hopes of an entire nation finally arrived at the embassy on Monday, September 9th. There it was locked in the wine cellar and given to the care of the ambassador's butler, who, as far as this could be determined, possessed the only key. The Americans anxiously awaited for the Tizard mission. It hadn't seemed that way at first. Sir Henry had arrived in Washington on August 22nd, expecting a welcome mat arranged by A.V. Hill. Instead, he complained to this diary: "No administrative arrangements made for my mission. No office, no typist, etc." Felt rather annoyed. The bad taste had not lingered, however. The next day, Tizard hurtled with Navy Secretary Franklin Knox to establish the ground rules for exchange. On the 26th, he received an audience with Franklin D. Roosevelt, who welcomed him but explained that political considerations prevented the United States from sharing details of the Norden bomb site. Most important of all, 2 days later, over dinner at the Cosmos Club, an exclusive Lafayette Square haven for the inner circles of science, art, and literature, Tizard met Vannevar Bush. With his raw-boned face, wire-rimmed glasses, and piercing gaze, the charismatic Bush in many ways formed Tizard's mirror image on the western side of the Atlantic. Scion of 7 or 8 generations of Cape Cod Yankees, and equipped with a telltale northeastern twang, he could be confidently stamped "Made in America," just as Tizard, with his accent, pince-nez, and somewhat aloof manner, left no doubt of his origins. Like Tizard, Bush hid a hard edge behind a calm demeanor. Like Tizard, too, he was a scientist, an MIT electrical engineer who had pioneered early computing, responsible for marshaling civilian science and technology for war. Few men would match his power during the war years, and his dominion grew to include medical research, the atomic bomb, and virtually all forms of chemical and conventional warfare. Of the men whose death in the summer of 1940 would have been the greatest calamity for America, the president is first and Dr. Bush would be second or third. Noted the multimillionaire investment banker Alfred Loomis, a Bush friend destined to play a role pivotal in the radar story. Bush had been the nation's capital since late 1938, when he became president of the prestigious Carnegie Institution of the Washington and private research organization endowed by steel baron Andrew Carnegie. However, he dined with the Tizard and chairman of the National Defense Research Committee, established by presidential order 2 months earlier to mobilize civilian scientists for war. Bush had created the NDRC almost through sheer personal will. During World War I, working on submarine detection, he had seen firsthand the distinct lack of cooperation between civilian scientists and the military. So he convinced the idea of establishing a new national committee to bridge the gap. Maneuvering deftly through the Washington maze, he drew on the influential lawyers Oscar Cox and Commerce Secretary Harry Hopkins to negotiate an interview with the president. Bush entered the Oval Office in June 12, 1940, carrying a single sheet of paper with a 4-paragraph sketch of the proposed agency. Less than 10 minutes later, Roosevelt had signed on. "That's okay," he told the feisty engineer. "Put OK, FDR on it." Some Washingtonians complained that the NDRC represented a power grab by a small band of scientists and engineers working outside the established channels. Bush made no bones about it. "That, in fact, is exactly what it was," he once admitted. But his personal mandate from Roosevelt extended to helping this country excel in the arts of war if that be necessary. And while he respected the military's turf, Bush made certain people never forgot who had issued his orders. The Carnegie president moved quickly to solidify his power base, bringing in as key lieutenants some old friends and conferencers. MIT President Carl Compton, Harvard University President James B. Conant, and Frank B. Jewett, president of the National Academy of Sciences, and Bell Telephone Laboratories. The scientific cabal, Bush co-conspirators in conceiving the NDRC, immediately launched a survey of Army and Navy research activities and began compiling a list of technical jobs to take over, either because the work had not yet gotten underway or because once the United States abandoned its neutrality and the military would have to drop them to meet more pressing demands. At the same time, the men contacted some 775 universities, industrial labs, and nonprofit institutions, compiling a roster of personnel and facilities in scientific arenas likely to affect the war. This was the Bible. By that time, Bush dined with Tizard on August 28th. He had mustered the forces into several main divisions covering everything from armor and ordnance to communications, explosives, and patents. Radar matters fell to Carl Compton's Division D, Instruments and Controls. Since the military survey showed that the Army and Navy both had already made strides in meter wave radar, and NDRC adopted as its domain the vague promise of microwaves, naming Alfred Loomis chairman of a special microwave committee, Section D1. It was a natural insider's choice. Loomis sat on the MIT board and had contributed funds to the Institutional General's microwave research. Moreover, he was noted amateur physicist who conducted his own fledgling microwave radar studies on a private estate outside New York City and therefore appreciated the challenges in store. While the various NDRC divisions could probably all delve into British black box and find interesting treasures, it was on the microwave radar front, a top priority for both groups, that Bush and Tizard found their perfect match. The American possessed the presidential authority to develop the technology. The Englishman had the cavity magnetron. When the two men met at the Cosmos Club, Bush remained unaware of the magnetron's existence, but he made it his business to know what was going on, and had been tipped off, probably by A.V. Hill, to certain generalities of the British radar bonanza long before the mission arrived. Face to face at last, however, he felt compelled to advise Tizard that although the NDRC welcomed a meeting with British mission, the two groups should keep their distance until the U.S. military opened the talks. That way, Washington insiders could not accuse them of plotting some sort of conspiracy. Once the exchange was formally underway, Bush would take steps to correct the situation. Tizard took the cue. While waiting for the NDRC to be let in on the talks, he and Bush met several times, behind the barn, as Wiley engineer called it. It is not clear what transpired between the two men, so alike and so seemingly destined to forge a new bond. Most likely they covered general logistics, hinting at the shape of things to come in the clubby ways at which both were so adept. In any case, as the entourage began sharing extensive details on long-wave radar and other subjects with the U.S. military representatives in early September, Tizard managed to give the impression of an extraordinary advance without revealing the secret of the cavity magnetron. Even when the Navy showed its visitors an experimental, extremely low-powered 10-centimeter radar system. It wasn't until September 16th that Vannevar Bush won formal approval from both the Army and Navy for the NDRC to join the exchange. Only did Sir Henry play his trump card. The British disclosed the existence of the cavity magnetron at the first extensive contact between the Tizard mission and the NDRC members, a party hosted by Alfred Loomis the night of September 19th at the Wardman Park Hotel. The rambling 1,800-room megaplex dominated the southeast corner of Connecticut Avenue and Woodley Road, just a stone's throw from the shorehand, where Tizard had set up shop in the office suite swept daily for bugs. Eddie Bowen and John Cookcroft showed up at Loomis's rooms around 9 o'clock. Bowen had returned from Canada the night of the 11th, and two men had spent the past week detailing British meter wave radar accomplishments to American military officials at the War Department and nearby Naval Research Laboratory. Among the disclosures were technical details of the chain home early warning stations already doing, Yeoman service in the Battle of Britain, radio homing beacons, and submarine hunting radars and identification. Friend or foe, IFF, a radio beacon carried in planes designed to help radar operators distinguish friendlies from the enemy. The exchange had proven interesting, but only marginally useful to the British. Going into the meetings, both sides were convinced the others could not possibly possess radar. But as they quickly discovered, each had invented the technology independently in the mid-1930s, within a few months of each other. In fact, the British chain home low, which guarded against low-flying planes, turned out to be virtually identical to the U.S. Navy's CXAM radar, operating on the same frequency and sharing several other technical features. As far as anything the British could use in the war effort, however, pickings were slim. The Americans did enjoy an edge in receiver technology, but at the same time, the United States had not developed airborne radars or anything like IFF. The few other systems in existence had seen little operational use. If Bowen and Cockcroft were hoping for more on microwave front from contact with Loomis Group, they were not disappointed. Vannevar Bush was not on hand. He preferred to delegate authority and leave his lieutenants alone. However, besides the host, the small gathering included Carol Wilson, Bush's personal assistant and alter ego, Carl Compton, and Admiral Harold Bowen, director of the Naval Research Lab. The admiral, who had earlier authored an internal memo discounting the idea of British radar, apparently harbored ongoing doubts about the exchange. He appeared to drink heavily at the party, but Compton suspected his colleague of feigning to be farther gone than he really was in order to avoid sharing information. British sensed such misgivings. I still remember rather doubtful opening with the U.S. officers suspicious as to whether we were putting all our cards on the table. Cockcroft related. The Americans show their hand first, though, detailing an exhaustive survey of the nation's general microwave research that Loomis Compton had conducted over the summer. It soon became clear to Bowen and Cockcroft that for 10-centimeter waves emitted by the cavity magnetron, Bell Telephone Laboratories and General Electric both could contribute a lot to receiver technology. Bell Labs, Stanford University, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, they were told, also conducted advanced research in microwave waveguides and horn-shaped antennas. The British physicists found the information exceedingly helpful in pinpointing areas to visit. Their host, however, confessed to being at loose ends trying to find a transmitter tube able to generate enough power to make for a feasible centimeter radar system. By the time of Loomis's party, a stymied microwave committee had steeled itself to write a report. Monsieur Sign, as one member, explained that we didn't know what to do next. Bowen and Cockcroft quickly pulled out the cavity magnetron. By one account, they typically carried the device in a small wooden box whose lid was fastened by the thumb screws, and told their dumbfounded listeners that it could generate 10 kilowatts of power at 10 centimeters, roughly 1,000 times the output of the best US tube on the same wavelength. In one fell swoop, the disclosure dispelled any tension left in the room. And from that point on, things went smoothly. It was a gift from the gods, we disclosed to Alfred Loomis and Carl Compton. Bowen boasted late in life. The financier Swifted embraced the offering, inviting his newfound friends to Tuxedo Park, the posh retreat about 35 miles northwest of New York City, where he had built his private laboratory. It was time for mere mortals to get to work. Alfred Lee Loomis Scientific Playground, a stone mansion with medieval-style tower and battlements, overlooked a small lake in the foothills of New York's Ramapo Mountains. Chapter 2, Radiation Laboratory. It was the greatest cooperative research establishment in the history of the world. Quote by Carl Compton. The investment banker turned physicist lived a few miles away in spacious stucco colonial. He had purchased the second estate in 1926 when his extracurricular research outgrew his garage. He overhauled the tower and basement into a first-class scientific facility, complete with machine shop, 40-foot spectrograph, and a dozen or more labs. The main house, with its panoply of bedrooms and expansive living quarters, was reserved for the small staff of Loomis Laboratories and the many guests invited for an idyllic working vacation. In the late 1930s, hoping to move closer to the action, Loomis built, just behind the labs, a unique third house that featured double glass walls for insulation and ventilation. His wife Ellen refused to leave their longtime home, so this quarters, designed by the noted Swiss architect William Lascaze and shielded by oak, maple, and hemlock, was often reserved for guests on private liaisons. One of the giant behind-the-scene figures of the day, Loomis had graduated cum laude from Harvard School in 1912 and gone straight to Wall Street, where he made a fortune financing public utilities sprouting up around the country. Along with his brother-in-law, Landon K. Thorne, he owned outright the modern-day resort of Hilton Head Island, which the two partners set aside as private hunting and riding reserve. On the eve of World War II, Loomis enjoyed an almost unrivaled reach deep into the country's power structure, in government, science, and industry. His favorite cousin was the veteran diplomat Henry L. Stimson. He would serve as the secretary throughout the coming conflict. An intimate of the heads of major corporations and universities, the financier could pick up the phone and cut through red tape. When his friend Ernest O. Lawrence, the University of California at Berkeley physicist, complained about the price of iron for his new cyclotron, Loomis simply dialed the chairman of the U.S. Steel Corporation, Edward Stettinius. "Hello, Ed. This is Alfred. I'm with a young chap that I know you would like to meet. When can we come over?" A gadgeteer since childhood, Loomis gradually took on more serious scientific studies in his spare time. Beginning in the late 1920s, continuing for more than a decade, the private Hilltop Laboratory became the fountainhead of a series of investigations ranging from ultrasonics to the study of brain waves and the construction of the world's most accurate clocks. Tuxedo Park was also the scene of noted international colloquia. The list of guests brought in, all expenses paid, with a special train waiting at New York's Pennsylvania station, swelled to include Albert Einstein, Werner Heisenberg, and James Franck. In the late 1930s, already retired from business life and thinking about applicability of science to the looming war, Loomis turned his attention to microwaves and radio detection. Over the summer of 1940, a small research team assembled at Tuxedo and installed a crude device in a Loomis Labs truck, making what may have been the first radar gun. Positioned to track cars on a nearby highway, the contraption proved so successful at catching speeders, one researcher remarked, "For the Lord's sake, don't let the cops know about this." Eddie Bowen and John Cockcroft made the Hygeria to Loomis's research haven on Saturday, September 28, 1940. There was a sense of crisis in their world back home. In the just ended week, 1,500 of their countrymen had been killed in German air raids, bringing the month's total to nearly 7,000. In return, the British were bombing Berlin every night. And a day earlier, on the 27th, Japan had formally joined Italy and Germany in the tripartite pact, which stipulated that if one of the countries got into a war with the United States, the other two would help. One of the Loomis cars met the pair at LaGuardia Airport and whisked them to Tuxedo Park, a pleasant drive through countryside resplendent with the red and yellow hues of the changing autumn leaves. To take part in the seminal meeting with the two Tizard mission representatives, Loomis had invited a handful of other dignitaries. Notable among them were Carol Wilson and Microwave Committee Secretary Edward Ballas, an MIT professor who had received his master's degree under Vannevar Bush, then gone on to become one of the country's foremost authorities in high-frequency and communications research. The men were gathered primarily to explore the cavity's magnetron's full ramifications. As if savoring the anticipation, however, Loomis spent a good part of the day showing his visitors the American state of the art. At a nearby airport, he demonstrated his own primitive continuous wave microwave radar based on klystron transmitter, which detected strong reflections from the Goodyear blimp and tracked two-seater planes up to a mile away. After dinner, the suspense was further built by passing hours going over American developments and the benefits of pushing the technology into symmetric wavelengths. It wasn't until Sunday night that Bowen and Cockcroft finally reached into a small brown bag and extracted the cavity magnetron, spreading the accompanying blueprints and other technical drawings on Loomis's sitting room floor. Earlier that day, the group had been joined by another microwave committee member, Hugh Willis, director of research for Sperry Gyroscope Company. For 3 hours, the high-powered group huddled around the device in animated conversation, discussing it and a few related British developments. As Bowen later wrote, the atmosphere was electric. They found it hard to believe that such a small device could produce so much power, and that they lay on the table in front of us might prove to be salvation of the Allied cause. Ed Ballas, for one, concurred. All we have to do was sit in admiration and gasp, he recalled. The disclosure, far more complete than the cursory overview presented at the Washington hotel party, gave the microwave committee a new life. Loomis returned to New York City and called a special luncheon meeting to bring those industrial members of the committee not able to attend the Tuxedo Park confab up to speed. Within a few days, a demonstration of the magnetron was in the works. Bowen and Cockcroft headed back to Washington to clear the arrangements with Tizard. Sir Henry returned to Britain via the Pan Am Clipper early in October, but not before settling a £5 bet with Cockcroft that their country would have been invaded before his homecoming. Bowen accompanied the mission head on the short flight from Washington to LaGuardia, going over the final details. Tizard told the Welshman to put the Americans to manufacture the magnetron for all you are worth. On the 3rd, Bowen brought the device to Bell Labs headquarters at 463 West Street, at the corner of Bethune on the western edge of Greenwich Village. Waiting were the lab's research director, Mervyn Kelly, a radio and television research head, Ralph Bowen, and a host of valve experts whose name was Welshman recognized from the research papers. J. G. Wilson, A. L. Samuel, J. O. McNally. The men discussed the magnetron at length. as Bowen produced blueprints and went over the rough specifications for running it. A 10,000-volt anode potential to extract electrons from the cathode, and a 1,500 Gauss magnetic field to bend and shape the electron flow. The Americans grew excited. If it worked as indicated, Bell would mass produce the device. Kelly and his associates wanted to conduct a test right away, but Bowen needed to go to MIT on the other business. He left the magnetron at West Street for safekeeping, and the men arranged to meet 3 days later at Bell's laboratory in nearby Whippany, New Jersey. Bowen returned to New York on Saturday, October 5th, the day before the big event, spending the night as Ralph Bowen's guest in Summit, New Jersey. Across the Atlantic back on September 7th, Hitler began daily attacks on London, opening the period of war later called the Blitz. October 5th saw the beginning of German air raids that came only at night. Hundreds of thousands of Londoners began sleeping in the underground. In New Jersey, Bowen and Bound passed the evening drinking martinis and watching a Mickey Rooney movie at local cinema. But on the 6th, the mood turned more serious. In nervous anticipation, the pair drove the few miles to the rambling Whippany Research and Development Facility, passing a long road into an experimental station marked by low-flung buildings and scattering huts. Bone ushered his passenger into one of the buildings in a room filled with electronic equipment, among other engineering paraphernalia. Bowen took note of a large electromagnetic common and university physics department. Wilson, Samuel, and other key members of Bell's staff were already assembled for the magnetron's first demonstration on American soil. Aware of the stakes, Bowen felt increasingly nervous as someone checked the magnetic field and ran the filament up to the required potential. Who could say what would happen? The magnetron had journeyed 3,000 miles and hadn't been tested in 2 months. Very gingerly, we switched on the anode potential and were immediately rewarded with a glow discharge about an inch long coming from the output terminal. The Welshman relates, I had not seen anything like this before, and we looked at it in amazement. On the spot estimates put the power output at between 10 and 15 kilowatts. This was some 7 times the power generated by Bell's own microwave radar, a 40-centimeter naval set under development. And it was likely better than the promise factor of 1,000 greater than anything available on such a short wavelength in the United States, or the rest of the world for that matter. Bowen left for Washington walking on air. The magnetron's successful debut engendered a firestorm. In the wake of the Tuxedo Park tete-a-tete, Loomis had already excitedly told his cousin, the war secretary, that the British invention had pushed the American radar development program ahead 2 years. With the Whippany demonstration erasing any remaining doubts about the power of the British invention, Loomis, Carl Compton, and Vannevar Bush were unanimous that a central laboratory should be created to develop radar systems around the device. The men felt an acute sense of urgency. Close to home, the NDRC needed to bulldoze past any opposition it might encounter from the services, which turned a skeptical eye toward a civilian agency taking up wartime radar work. Against this lay the backdrop of war. As Tizard and others had predicted, the left switch to nightly bombardments had overwhelmed the chain home system, which did not possess the resolution needed for nighttime inceptions. Supplementing the system with symmetric radars installed in fighters themselves could prove decisive. Yet, as was abundantly clear from meeting with the Tizardly mission representatives, the magnetron's still experimental device had to be geared up for mass production. It needed to be combined with receivers, antennas, and a myriad of other components, and tailored to meet the various needs of the services, with different systems for airborne radar, submarine hunters, anti-aircraft guns, and bombers. By almost any measure, the job would take on at least 2 years and nearly unlimited resources. With no time to waste, Loomis called a second Tuxedo Park meeting for the weekend of October 12th and 13th to nail down details of the revitalization American Centimeter Radar program. But just as Bell Labs got busy coping with the transmitter for mass production, an unexpected finding almost brought the endeavor to a screeching halt. On October 7th, the day after Whippany demonstration, Eddie Bowen received a call from Mervyn Kelly, who forcefully summoned the Welshman to New York. The Bell research chief would not be specific over the telephone, but something was drastically amiss. Oh my God, Bowen thought. The magnetron must have blown up. He couldn't make the trip that day, but awoke at 5:30 the next morning to grab an early flight. He was met in the West Street foyer and ushered to a top-floor conference room. Kelly and several staff members greeted him coolly, laid the magnetron on the table, and rolled out the blueprints from the black box, then produced an X-ray of the device in their possession. Looking it all over, Bowen grew astonished. The blueprint showed a magnetron with six resonant cavities, just as he believed the design called for. However, the X-ray revealed Bell's copy of the transmitter had 8 cylindrical holes. There was little I could say, Bowen recalled. He asked to send a cable to General Electric Company labs in Wembley, where initial production versions of the magnetron had been fabricated. But he had forgotten that he sat at the heart of telephony. It was not long before Kelly's crew had GEC engineering wizard Eric C.S. McGaw on the line. At first, McGaw was also bewildered. Then the penny dropped. 10 of the first dozen devices had been made with standard 6 cavities. But the remaining pair had involved novel designs, one with 7 holes, the other with 8. In the haste to prepare for the Tizard mission, no one had remembered this fact. And when Bowen had picked out the best one, he had unknowingly selected the 8-cavity version. The realization broke the tension with Kelly. But then the men had to consider whether Bell should build copies from the blueprints or from the device they held. We agreed that there was only one way to go, to copy the one which they knew worked, relates Bowen. After that, all the British magnetrons were made with 6 holes, the American models with 8. In the wake of that heart-stopping episode, everything rushed ahead madly. That weekend, a number of NDRC specialists showed up at Tuxedo Park to learn more specifics of the British Radar Organization, as well as glean clues to their guest thoughts for the American lab. In addition to Bolus and Wilson, 2 new important faces joined the group. One belonged to Frank Lewis, a Loomis employee recently cleared to hear microwave radar details. The second newcomer was none other than Ernest O. Lawrence, still riding the wave of winning the 1939 Nobel Prize for his invention of the cyclotron, which had opened the door on the mysteries and delights of quantum physics by allowing scientists to bombard atomic nuclei with the particle beams of unheard of energies and intensities. Lawrence had climbed on board the microwave committee train early in October after an urgent summons from Bush. On a resonant note, too, the first day coincided with Franklin Roosevelt's stirring speech in Dayton, Ohio. Our course is clear, the president advised, seeking an unprecedented 3rd term in the coming November elections. Our decision is made. We will continue to pile up our defense and our armaments. We will continue to help those who resist aggression, and who now hold the aggressors far from our shoes. Loomis's gathering started out easy. Bowen remembered losing badly to Lawrence at tennis and having a casual drink with Averill Harriman, a future U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, who had a house nearby and stopped in to say hello. But the next day, things took a more serious turn. At their host's urging, Bowen and Cockcroft laid out the British needs, giving highest priority to a 10 centimeter airborne interception radar to be fitted in night fighters. The British considered such a set absolutely vital to stemming the nightly Luftwaffe raids on London. Second on the list was some sort of long-range navigation system for guiding bombers to and from targets without depending on a signal from the plane itself. Third in priority came a 10 centimeter gun-laying radar to direct anti-aircraft fire. In response to American prodding, the two Tizard mission representatives began laying out the technical requirements for their wish list. Cockcroft detailed the full specifications necessary for anti-aircraft radar. Bowen wrote out his specs for the airborne radar and outlined a proposed British navigation system in which ground stations transmitted a grid of precise radio beams that enabled aircraft to fix their locations. Two men also described how British had set up civilian-run labs and drafted university people for the research. The disclosure struck a chord with the Americans. Lawrence, for one, had joined the microwave committee, extremely pessimistic about the British ability to survive the German onslaught. But upon hearing Bowen and Cockcroft describe British radar in detail, he saw things in a new light. This changes the odds, he said. Let's get going as fast as possible and do anything we can do to help the British. Loomis hardly needed encouragement. Back in this New York apartment at 21 East 79th Street the following Monday, he set about twisting the arms of key industrial contacts. Mervyn Kelly at Bell Labs, Radio Corporation of America, research boss Ralph Beall, and Sperry Hugh Willis to deliver 5 working sets of magnetrons and other needed equipment within a month. Under the agreement hammered out, Bell promised to produce magnetrons, Sperry the parabolic reflectors, and RCA contracted to deliver cathode ray tubes, modulated power supplies, and intermediate frequency amplifiers. Representatives of General Electric and Westinghouse could not make the hastily arranged meeting, but GE, an American company not related to its British namesake, soon took on the job of supplying magnets for the magnetrons, while Westinghouse joined RCA in producing antennas. If anyone harbored doubts as to the urgency of the task at hand, it was only necessary to look to Britain. The night of October 15th was the worst of the war so far. Bombers pounded London from 8 in the evening until 5 the next morning, giving rise to the 900 fires. A bomb broke through the platform at Balham Underground Station, creating an avalanche of debris that buried alive 64 of the 600 sleeping below. All told, 400 Londoners died that night. By that Friday, October 18th, with Eddie Bowen imploring them on, the microwave committee had approved the contracts along with the idea of establishing a central lab, adopting as the first order of business the 3 projects set out at Tuxedo Park. The enterprise marked a novel departure from past American wartime ventures. The lab would be administered by civilian scientists, and it would not work directly for the military. Not only had the British sung the praises of such a setup, NDRC members had grown frustrated in their early dealings with the services. We were quick to learn that every time you mentioned anything, they'd said, "Well, we've done that," or "We're trying it," Bolus recounted. And they'd open a file cabinet and show you a piece of paper that led us to the next step, to the conclusion that we must have a laboratory of our own. In other words, not a committee going around and helping the services by telling them what we think we ought to do, because they knew damn well that we had no control over them. Money would come from civilian agency, the NDRC, which in turn had special access to the presidential tap. The idea sailed along. A week later, on October 25th, Bush and his committee gave the plan their final approval, allocating a budget of $455,000 for the lab's first year of operation. The site for the lab was not chosen until the last minute. Apparently, seeking proximity to Washington, Loomis held out for the Carnegie Institution, but Bush feared disciplinary and administrative problems in his own shop. I protested, and we had a hell of an argument that took half the night and a bottle of scotch, the NDRC chairman recalled. After considering several other possibilities, MIT finally seemed the best bet. Not only did the school have a rich history in microwave research, the group also reasoned that opening a new lab at a top research university would attract a minimum of attention. The only potential snag came from Frank Jewett. Both Loomis and Ed Bolus suspected the Bell Labs chief might try to snare the proposed radar facility for his own organization. They maneuvered to feel him out during a meeting in Bush's office on October 16th. Sure enough, Jewett balked at the idea of an MIT-based lab. Bell had run a similar effort on submarine detection in the First War. He pointed out near its West Street headquarters. A laboratory of this character needed Bell-type management. It was too complex for an institution like MIT. There was a pause, apparently realizing he had raised the hackles of Bush and Bolus. Both MIT men, the Bell had beat a tactical retreat. He did not mean, Jewett stressed, to denigrate the school's overall ability. Before he could continue, Loomis broke in. I'm so glad, Dr. Jewett, that you approved the idea of having the laboratory at MIT. The decision has been made. The next day, the three men, now of single mind, sandbagged Carl Compton when he showed up in Washington for a microwave committee meeting and virtually wrung an agreement from the MIT president. Compton made an emergency phone call back to Cambridge to ensure the needed 10,000 square feet of laboratory space could be freed up. Later, he met with Massachusetts Governor Leverett Saltonstall to arrange space for flight tests of planned airborne radar at a National Guard hangar in East Boston Airport, predecessor to Logan Airport. Initially, the upstart facility simply bore the moniker Microwave Laboratory. Within the first few weeks, however, to further mislead unwanted observers, it was christened the Radiation Laboratory. The Microwave Committee members hoped that enemy spies would merely consider it an East Coast version of E.O. Lawrence's Berkeley Radiation Laboratory, which specialized in the esoteric field of nuclear research, still not considered a viable military pursuit. Recruitment for the lab had begun immediately, even before all of these plans crystallized. Following the British example, it was decided that the radiation lab would draw on university scientists, primarily nuclear physicists, who were familiar with high-frequency radio waves from their accelerator work. Lawrence turned down the director's position to pursue construction of his latest brainchild, a gigantic 184-inch cyclotron. But no better headhunter could be found than the legendary Berkeley physicist whose face had already graced the cover of Time and whose lab served as a mecca for nuclear physicists wanting to learn how to build accelerators. A man of sudden bursts of excitement, Lawrence zealously got to work. On October 8th, he stopped by Harvard to sound out Kenneth Bainbridge, a native of Cooperstown, New York, who had designed and built the school's first cyclotron. 6 days later, with the noted mass spectroscopist firmly on board, the two had met with Loomis in New York to discuss the character of the proposed laboratory. It was the same day Loomis spent hashing out industry commitments. Another early feeler went to Lee A. Dubridge and a Lawrence protege who had led the University of Rochester physics department to national prominence, partly by building one of the first East Coast cyclotrons and partly by daring to hire the school's first Jewish faculty, most notably the Austrian Victor Weisskopf. Besides his administrative abilities, Dubridge then served as chairman of Rochester's physics department and dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. The popular Hoosier exhibited an unbridled desire to take part in the war effort. Lawrence called from Loomis's apartment on October 15th. I can't tell you about it, but I assure you it's very important. He informed Dubridge the recruit took the train to New York and the next day accepted a job as technical director, soon to be changed to overall director. If Lawrence backed the program, the Rochester dean once noted, that was what I wanted to be in. Dubridge and Lawrence immediately began beating the bushes for additional conscripts. They visited Lewis A. Turner at Princeton and made the theoretician a consultant. Next, Dubridge attended a convention at Indiana University to sound out other researchers, including the highly regarded Columbia University physicist I. Rabbi and University of Illinois physicist chairman Wheeler Loomis, no relation to Alfred. Both men ultimately signed on. A perfect drawing card appeared at the end of October when some 600 scientists gathered in Boston for a conference on applied nuclear physics. At Loomis's suggestion, Ballas arranged a series of lab visits and special seminars. MIT waveguide pioneer Wilmer L. Barrow lectured on his own ultra-high frequency work to bring a select few up to speed on general microwave problems. Loomis and Compton also hosted a historic luncheon meeting at the exclusive Algonquin Club on Commonwealth Avenue, bringing together Bowen, who had used a secret entrance with about two dozen American counterparts. In an upstairs dining room, recruits signed an agreement of secrecy before receiving a primer on the new lab and its mission. It was a grand pep talk and got the whole group keen to be in on it. Dubridge wrote E.O. Lawrence a few days later. Not everyone could come immediately, but about 20 physicists agreed to start by December 1st. So the lab will start off with a bang. Dubridge continued in his update to Lawrence. All of these people can go to work on some project even before they are cleared by the FBI. MIT will take the responsibility, and they have all signed off for Compton's MIT files, a copy of Espionage Act. Only the cleared ones can know the whole story, of course, he noted. I'm still dizzy at the pace things are going, but at least feel that things are under control. And then everyone is working together beautifully, and it's going to be great fun. Dubridge had good reason to be optimistic, for before him lay the nucleus of extraordinary group. Almost none of the men had any experience with microwaves or basic engineering, but sharp minds abounded. Some acutely aware that uranium nucleus had been split by German scientists the year before, fretted over the possibility of atomic power in Hitler's hands. Many in this fairly tight-knit physics community were Jews or had studied abroad and maintained deep ties to the imperiled Jewish European scientific community. Still others felt a strong sense of kinship with their beleaguered British cousins, a sense of outrage brought home by nightly bombardments suffered by Londoners. Whatever their reasons, almost to a man, the radiation lab's new staffers did not take well to events in Germany. No one characterized the fervor more than Isidore Isaac Rabbi, one of those invited to the Algonquin Club. Born in old Austro-Hungarian town of Riemenau, but raised since infancy in Brooklyn, he hated the Nazis. At 42, one of the elder statesmen of physics, he would permeate the lab with his driving force. The war in Europe was going so badly, I was dying to get into something, he later explained. When I heard of this, I said, I want to be in on it. Rabbi joined the lab on November 6th, the day after Roosevelt's re-election victory over Wendell Willkie. Within a few days, he enticed two of his top students, Gerald Zacharias and Norman Ramsey. It took Zacharias 3 weeks to get the necessary clearance. Ramsey, who had started work 5 weeks earlier at the University of Illinois, where he had expected to spend his professional life, checked in around mid-month. Eleanor, his wife of mere 2 months, won the distinction of becoming the first out-of-town spouse to arrive. Turning to nearby Harvard, the fledgling enterprise conscripted J. Curry Street, co-discovered of the muon. He was joined by two up-and-comers, cherub-faced former Rhodes scholar Ivan Gidding and a young instructor named Edward Purcell, who had showed up at his office one night to get in some extra work and stumbled across Bainbridge and Rabbi conducting an early rad lab planning session in the faculty room. Getting started work in mid-November, but teaching obligations prevented Purcell from joining the lab full-time until the next January. E.O. Lawrence contributed two of his brightest protégés, Edward Macmillan and Luis Alvarez. A bon voyage party saw the young physicist off as they boarded a cross-country train in the second week of November. Robert Oppenheimer, another Berkeley physicist, gave each a bottle of whiskey. He had abandoned his usual practice of handing out books to those about to take long trips after the physicist Paul Dirac had politely refused the offer, saying, "I never read books, they interfere with thought." The two arrived in Cambridge 4 days later. Alvarez received notebook number 11, his colleague number 12. These men represented the cream of the crop of American physics. 5 would bear the distinction in later years of winning the Nobel Prize. Ultimately, 5 other Rad Lab staffers or consultants would also garner science's top honor. But for the moment, these scientific stars were expected to abjure individualism, absorb a brief indoctrination, and get to work as an engineering team. They dropped their research, sometimes almost literally. Nuclear physicist Ernest Polliard, a Yale recruit, received a telegram from Dewbridge asking him to come to Cambridge. He stuffed the slip of a paper in his lab coat, and when he moved, hung the jacket up and left it at Yale. As these and other recruits steamed in, Dewbridge and a few close advisors toiled furiously on general logistics. Ken Bainbridge set about making salary arrangements and running down rooming and housing facilities. Melvin Eastham, president of the General Radio Corporation and the Radiation Lab's early business manager, laid preliminary plans for library resources, power supplies, and the like. By Armistice Day, November 11th, bare bones were in place. A tiny nucleus of physicists gathered in their new headquarters in 4133, the obscure MIT code to designate building and room number, for the first official Rad Lab meeting. Carl Compton provided attendees with situational overview before giving away to Alfred Loomis, who filled everyone in on the basics of microwave radar. By the next day, when Bell Labs delivered 5 magnetrons right on schedule, the main organizational outlines had been agreed upon, problems parceled out among 7 technical sections arranged along component lines, transmitter, receiver, antenna, and so on. "We chose up just like a baseball teams," remembered Rabbi. "We chose upsides. What would we take? Well, I took the magnetron." Even those not working directly with the remarkable device were stunned by its potential. A sudden improvement by a factor of 3,000 may not surprise physicists, but is almost unheard of in engineering. Luis Alvarez recalled in the mid-1980s, if automobiles had been similarly improved, modern cars could cost about $1 and go 1,000 miles on a gallon of gas. We were correspondingly awed by the cavity magnetron. Suddenly, it was clear that microwave radar was there for the asking. For all the power and promise, however, no one on either side of the Atlantic really fundamentally understood how the strange transmitter worked. However, in the magnetron's cylindrical cavities, electrons were accelerated and bunched into tight, coherent packets. In the Rad Lab's early days, a group of theorists gathered around the tube's disassembled parts. It's simple, Rabbi told the group. It's kind of like a whistle. Okay, Rabbi, said Edward U. Condon, another Berkeley trained physicist brought in from Westinghouse Research Laboratory. How does a whistle work? At night, when no one remained to engage in such debates, the magnetrons were prudently locked in a safe in Dubridge's office. To keep away prying eyes, the Rad Lab's windows were painted black. The war took on fresh fury as Rad Labs hummed to life. The night of November 3, no German air raids had materialized over London for the first time since September 7th. But 11 days later, 500 bombers sparked a firestorm in Coventry that killed 568 and reduced thousands of buildings to rubble. Production of a host of vital war factories was shut down for months. The British retaliation 2 days later killed 233 civilians in Hamburg. On November 17th, in the midst of the maelstroms, Eddie Bowen drove up from Toledo Park with Lawrence and Loomis, who had already transferred his own lab's work to MIT and was giving demonstrations at East Boston Airport. That afternoon, to those cleared, the Welshman gave a talk on military tactics and about airborne interception. Lawrence soon left to press on with the recruiting, taking a leisurely train trip across the country and stopping at the University of Chicago, Purdue, and other major universities along the way. By mid-December, the Rad Lab had swollen to include 30 physicists, 3 guards, 2 stock boys, and 1 secretary, an 11-year veteran of MIT's electrical engineering department named Edith Baker, who would follow Dubridge for the next 50 years. A wooden penthouse compromised of gray-green tar paper sprang up on the roof of Building 6. By January 6, barely 3 weeks away, this was to hold a working microwave radar system. The rest of the basic goals had also been set. Alfred Loomis scrawled them on a chalkboard. A breadboard version of the first airborne radar should be installed in an Army B-18 aircraft by February 1. And within a month after that, the lab was to have met its top priority, a working centimeter set in a night fighter. No one knew for certain if any of these goals could be met. No one except Bowen had much experience even building a radar system, but that was all right. It was a talented bunch, and the energetic Welshman didn't mind sharing what we knew. In fact, he thrived on bringing the Yanks up to speed, providing the details of the British radar and mesmerizing them with the wild tales of how it all began.